What if the most famous child's voice in modern music history was never meant to grow up? In 1969, Michael Jackson appeared before the world with a sound that seemed almost unreal. His treble was high, steady, and eerily controlled, cutting through radios and television screens with a clarity that stunned audiences. It didn't wobble. It didn't strain. It didn't behave like the voice of a boy who would soon become a teenager. At first, the industry called it a gift. Fans called it destiny. But as time passed, a quieter question began to form behind studio doors. Every boy around him changed. Their voices cracked, dropped, and fractured under the weight of puberty. Michael's did not. By 1974, insiders were privately wondering how a teenage body could resist biology so completely. Because while the public celebrated a miracle, those close to the operation saw something else: control. Absolute methodical control. And at the center of it stood Joe Jackson. Joe controlled food. He controlled sleep. He controlled rehearsal schedules down to the minute. Discipline was not an abstract concept in the Jackson household. It was infrastructure. And according to whispered accounts that would surface years later, there may have been more variables under management than anyone was willing to admit. That is where the question begins to harden into something unsettling. Was Michael's voice preserved by rare talent alone, or was medical intervention used to protect a $1 million asset? Former associates would later point to unexplained doctor visits, missing stretches of medical timelines, and a silence that felt less like coincidence and more like design. Nothing documented, nothing proven, just gaps. And gaps, when paired with power, invite scrutiny. The voice that built an empire did not simply resist change. It was guarded. Chapter 1 begins there. Chapter 1. The Father and the Factory, 1968–1972. It began quietly inside a narrow house on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana. Music there was not a dream. It was a schedule. Childhood was not measured in birthdays but in hours rehearsed. Before contracts, before cameras, before screaming crowds, there was one man setting the tempo. Joe Jackson did not speak in the language of art. He spoke in output, precision, and control. Failure was not an option. It was a threat. By 1968, the family had already become something more rigid than a band. It was a system. Rehearsal started after school and pushed deep into the night. Missed notes meant punishment. Missed steps meant starting over. Michael Jackson, still very young, learned early that approval was conditional. Love arrived only after perfection. Michael would later describe the discipline plainly, without theatrics. Physical punishment was routine. It was not hidden. It was normalized. Then came the move from Gary to Detroit, from basements to boardrooms. In 1969, the family signed with Motown Records, and with that signature, childhood effectively ended. Motown didn't just want talent. They wanted reliability. Joe understood exactly what that required. The schedule hardened. School became secondary. Sleep became flexible. Rehearsals were timed. Performances stacked back to back. Interviews filled whatever space remained. Joe controlled meals. He controlled posture, tone, and vocal usage. According to later interviews, Michael was discouraged from speaking freely off stage. Silence preserved the instrument. Noise wasted it. Every decision passed through a single filter: does this protect the brand? By 1970, the Jackson 5 were no longer children from Indiana. They were a machine generating hits, appearances, and revenue. At the center of that machine was a voice that should not have been possible. High, clear, untouched by time. While other boys strained and cracked, Michael remained suspended in a register that sounded frozen. Joe noticed. More importantly, Joe feared what came next. Puberty was not theoretical. It was a deadline. Industry executives knew it. Doctors knew it. Joe knew it. If Michael's voice broke the sound that sold millions, could vanish overnight. Careers had ended that way before. Joe had watched it happen. And for a man obsessed with control, biology was the ultimate threat. So control tightened. Accounts from this period describe stricter routines. Food was monitored more closely. Sleep was enforced at irregular hours. Vocal strain outside of performance was minimized. Michael later said he lived in constant tension, afraid to relax his voice, afraid to laugh too loudly, afraid to be normal. Fear became maintenance. What makes this chapter disturbing is not a single act. It is the structure. Joe held absolute authority over minors, with no external oversight. Managers answered to him. Teachers deferred. Doctors, if consulted, were chosen by him. In that environment, boundaries blurred. What counted as discipline? What counted as harm, and who decided? By 1971, cracks appeared behind the scenes. Michael's anxiety increased. He developed stress-related symptoms, nausea, before shows, shaking, a sense of dread that never fully lifted. On stage, none of it showed. The voice remained flawless. That contrast became the product. Joe spoke openly about his fears, losing momentum, being replaced, the industry discarding acts the moment they faltered. To him, childhood was expendable. The voice was not. The factory metaphor becomes unavoidable here. Children entered one end. Performances came out the other. Emotions were waste. Vulnerability was inefficiency. Joe did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. Yet the power imbalance was total. Michael could not refuse, could not question, could not opt out. Every adult in the room worked toward the same outcome: success at any cost. Decades later, rumors would surface about medical consultations during these years. Nothing documented. Nothing proven. Just recalled appointments without records, timelines that didn't quite align. Absence that invites speculation precisely because control was so complete. What can be confirmed is simpler and darker. Joe ruled through fear. Michael lived inside it. The voice, the asset, was protected above the child who carried it. By 1972, the pattern was locked in. Joe as overseer. Michael as product. The factory running at full speed while the world applauded, unaware of the cost accumulating backstage. This chapter does not accuse. It reconstructs. Because before any later theories, before any whispered explanations, there was already a reality that cannot be denied: a father with unchecked power, an industry willing to look away, and a child whose body became the battlefield between nature and profit. As this era closes, the question that lingers is not whether harm occurred. It is whether anyone in that room was willing to stop it, or whether silence was simply the price everyone agreed to pay. The unusual puberty window, 1973–1976. It began during a period when nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. That was precisely what made it unsettling later. By early 1973, the Jackson operation appeared perfected. Rehearsals flowed seamlessly into recording sessions. Recording sessions bled into tour legs. Tours fed directly back into rehearsals, forming a closed circuit where momentum mattered more than reflection. The system ran continuously, leaving little room for pause, let alone change. Within that circuit, however, one expected transformation never arrived. On January 7, 1973, in Los Angeles, Michael Jackson turned 14. In most boys, this age announces itself audibly. High notes begin to strain. Cracks appear without warning. Registers fight each other before settling lower. Puberty rarely hides for long. Yet as winter passed into spring and the tour calendar filled, Michael's voice did none of that. It remained steady, high, remarkably consistent. Not just from show to show, but from year to year. Studio engineers were the first to notice, because sound leaves records, even when people do not. During closed recording sessions in March 1973, vocal takes showed no measurable fatigue, even after extended rehearsals. At first, this was praised as discipline, exceptional control. But when those recordings were quietly compared to tapes from 1971 and 1972, the similarity crossed into something stranger. Pitch alignment was nearly exact. What should have evolved had simply stayed still. At the same time, the public schedule grew more complicated. Official itineraries listed flights, performances, and press appearances. Yet between them appeared unexplained gaps, short windows of time that were never discussed openly. According to later backstage recollections, these gaps were dismissed with a single phrase: vitamin appointments. The wording mattered. Vitamins implied care, not control. It discouraged further questions. As spring progressed, timing began to attract quiet attention. On April 21, 1973, just hours before a critical Los Angeles recording session, Michael was driven to a private medical office before dawn. He was accompanied by one adult. No entourage. The visit lasted less than an hour. It left no visible paper trail and never appeared on tour documentation. By mid-afternoon, he was back in the studio delivering vocals with the same precision that had defined him for years. By late 1973, murmurs circulated among crew members. Not accusations. Observations. Michael spoke less off-stage. When he did, his voice was soft, careful, as if conserving something fragile. Warm liquids were always nearby. Laughter was restrained. After performances, he sometimes stood alone, one hand lightly touching his throat, as if confirming nothing had shifted. These moments passed quickly, but those who noticed them remembered. During this period, Joe Jackson's presence intensified. He attended rehearsals more frequently. He intervened during vocal warm-ups at the first hint of strain. Songs were cut short without explanation. Rest periods were enforced abruptly. In later interviews, Michael would describe the environment as suffocating, governed by fear rather than encouragement. Joe's focus, according to multiple accounts, was singular. The voice must not change. As 1974 arrived, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Michael was now 15. Televised appearances from February and March captured a voice indistinguishable from earlier years. Studio technicians, curious rather than suspicious, compared frequency ranges and found no measurable drop. What should have been a gradual descent had not begun. It was around this time that rumors took a more defined shape, though they remained carefully framed. No one spoke of extreme measures. Instead, phrases like stability and regulation surfaced in private conversations. A touring physician, according to one later recollection, mentioned hormonal balancing as a theoretical way to delay physical changes. No documentation supported this. Those repeating the story always emphasized uncertainty. Still, the idea lingered because it fit the environment. Delay was everything. In May 1974, during a demanding run of tour dates across major cities, private medical visits were recalled occurring within hours of televised performances. Each time Michael appeared on stage, composed, his voice floating effortlessly above the band. To audiences, it looked miraculous. To those watching closely, it looked managed. By 1975, tension reached its peak. At 16, Michael was well past the age when most voices begin settling into adulthood. Yet recordings from June and August still showed a dominant upper register, intact and controlled. Industry insiders began acknowledging privately that the window was unusual, not because such cases never occur, but because of how precisely this one aligned with commercial necessity. Behind closed doors, Joe's language reportedly shifted. He spoke less about success and more about timing, about getting through this phase, about holding things together just a little longer. One associate later recalled him saying, matter-of-factly, that everything depended on buying time. There was no emotion in the statement, only calculation. By early 1976, subtle changes finally appeared. Lower notes emerged cautiously, as if entering unfamiliar territory. There was no announcement, no explanation. The transition was framed as natural. By then, the brand was strong enough to absorb it. Publicly, the story ended there. Privately, what remained were the years that never fully made sense. A puberty window stretched too long. Appointments aligned too neatly with pressure points. a child living under absolute authority with no control over his body or voice. Nothing in this chapter resolves cleanly, because it was never designed to. There are no documents confirming the rumors. No signatures authenticating the whispers. What persists, instead, is alignment. Dates that coincide. Behaviors that repeat. Silences that refuse to fade. And long after the voice finally began to change, one question continued to echo quietly behind the applause. If nature had to wait, who decided it should? The body that had to wait 1977, 1981. The silence around Michael Jackson did not arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, one controlled answer at a time, until even his body seemed to move by permission rather than instinct. By 1977, the Jackson 5 era was loosening its grip, and a solo future was quietly forming. With that shift came a new pressure. It was no longer just about protecting a voice. It was about preserving an image that could not age too quickly, harden too visibly, or settle comfortably into adulthood. At 18, Michael existed between categories. On stage, his movements were sharp and fluid, precise but never heavy. Off-stage interviews glided past obvious questions. When reporters hinted at puberty, adulthood, or maturity, his answers dissolved into laughter or polite deflection. This was not shyness. It was choreography. Every public moment was designed to avoid anchoring him to a biological timeline the industry could not fully control. As 1977 turned into 1978, Los Angeles became the center of gravity. Recording sessions filled the days. Image planning filled the nights. Stylists softened silhouettes. Photographers avoided harsh lighting. Wardrobes emphasized youth over mass. And quietly, between rehearsals and studio calls, brief medical visits began punctuating the schedule. They were never announced, never explained. They happened early in the day, ended quickly, and left no visible trace. On March 14, 1978, before a high-profile studio booking, Michael was driven to a discreet clinic just off Wilshire Boulevard. The visit lasted less than 30 minutes. According to a later recollection from a personal assistant, there was no waiting room delay, no paperwork handed back. He returned subdued. Conversation was minimal. Then he recorded with clinical precision. The session was flawless. The moment passed. The pattern remained. By the end of 1978, those close to him noticed a contradiction that was difficult to articulate. Michael was getting older, slightly taller, but without the usual markers of physical acceleration. His frame stayed narrow. Facial hair barely appeared. Muscle mass increased only marginally, despite demanding choreography. Fans called it grace. Insiders quietly called it unusual. In 1979, pressure intensified. The solo transition demanded an image that could cross demographics without friction. The word used behind closed doors was universal. What that meant in practice was ambiguity. Masculinity, if it arrived too quickly, risked narrowing appeal. And so delay became strategy. It was during this period that a phrase began circulating quietly among those handling logistics rather than decisions. It was never spoken in meetings, never written down, just exchanged in low voices. Low-dose chemical suppression. The framing mattered. No surgery. No irreversible act. Just it was said, a way to slow certain processes while everything else caught up. No one claimed certainty. Every account emphasized speculation. But repetition gave the idea weight. On September 22, 1979, after a late afternoon clinic stopped preceding a televised rehearsal, a backup dancer later recalled Michael sitting alone, shoulders hunched, hands unusually cold to the touch. When asked if he felt sick, Michael smiled and said he was just tired. The dancer remembered the smile because it never reached his eyes. By 1980, control over medical access tightened further. Appointments were scheduled through a single channel. Staff were instructed not to ask questions. Health discussions were redirected or shut down entirely. On February 5, 1980, Michael attended another brief clinic visit hours before an intensive studio session. He arrived afterward, quiet, focused, distant, completed every take without error, and left immediately. Public interviews from this period reveal a narrowing of language. He spoke about music work and dreams, never about his body, never about growing older. When asked about adulthood, he smiled and pivoted away. Avoidance became part of the persona. The cost appeared in private. By 1981, emotional strain surfaced in fleeting moments. Michael withdrew socially. He avoided mirrors. He followed instructions without comment. A former assistant later recalled overhearing a hushed exchange between senior staff members discussing whether the delay could continue without consequences. The tone, they said, was not panic. It was calculation. Gradually, nature pressed back. Subtle changes emerged. A warmer vocal texture. A slightly stronger physical presence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing disruptive. Publicly, the transition appeared natural. Privately, it felt overdue. There is no document confirming chemical suppression. No record proving intent. What remains instead is alignment. Dates coinciding with pressure points. Behaviors repeating across years. A silence maintained by everyone who benefited from it. The body that waited did not do so by accident. It waited inside a system that valued timing over autonomy. And as the solo era ignited and the world applauded the result, the most unsettling detail lingered unspoken. If an image needed protection more than a person needed freedom, who was ever meant to choose consequences that lasted a lifetime? 1982-1993. The cost did not arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, disguised as success, until the damage became inseparable from the image the world celebrated. By 1982, as the solo era reached escape velocity, Michael Jackson stood at the center of global attention. On stage, he was untouchable. Off stage, he carried a body and a mind trained for control, long before consent had ever existed. The early 1980s reveal this if you look closely. From 1982 through 1987, his relationship with his own body shifted from expression to vigilance. Mirrors were approached cautiously. Weight, skin, posture, hair, and movement were monitored with relentless precision. Interviews avoided words like man, grown, or adult. Stylists softened angles. Wardrobe choices blurred edges. Choreography emphasized glide over force. The unspoken instruction remained consistent: do not harden, do not settle, do not age too quickly. Those closest to him described a man living inside rules he never wrote. He ate sparingly, slept irregularly, feared visible change. When muscle developed, it was disguised. When the voice warmed, technique concealed it. This was not indecision. It was conditioning. Control once imposed from the outside had moved inward. The system no longer needed an overseer. Michael enforced it himself. At the same time, dependence quietly replaced oversight. By 1983, unscheduled medical contact was no longer tolerated. Care became curated. Doctors were selected, rotated, and shielded from one another. Appointments were brief. Conversations were limited. Questions were discouraged. According to later accounts from assistants and security staff, health discussions occurred in fragments, always compartmentalized, never complete. This pattern intensified through 1984 and 1985. Michael traveled with medical support that remained present but invisible. Prescriptions were managed discreetly. Treatments were described using neutral language, balance, recovery, maintenance. Nothing sounded alarming. Everything sounded normal. And normalization in this context became the most dangerous element of all. Emotionally, the consequences surfaced in private moments. He avoided peers his own age. He gravitated toward environments where adulthood felt optional and childhood could be preserved. Staff observed mood swings, cycles of intense focus followed by withdrawal. When asked directly about his health, he deflected with humor. When pressed, he shut down. By 1987, the cycle had become self-sustaining. Control produced anxiety. Anxiety demanded more control. Doctors became anchors. Schedules became shields. The body was no longer experienced. It was managed. One longtime assistant later described it as living inside a checklist where deviation felt like danger. Then came 1993. On record. On camera. Without deflection. Michael publicly acknowledged that Joe Jackson had abused him as a child. The admission fractured the family narrative that had protected the past. Suddenly, what had been whispered became acknowledged. Fear was no longer speculation. It was testimony. With that admission, the emotional consequences sharpened. Control was no longer abstract. It had been enforced. Privately, the rupture deepened isolation. Trust eroded. The sense of safety that adulthood might have offered never arrived. Instead, Michael retreated further into controlled environments, studios, doctors' offices, closed rooms. The pattern tightened because it was familiar. It was during this period that one of the most unsettling rumors circulated among inner circles. A former medical liaison later recalled a quiet conversation in late 1992. An unnamed physician, they claimed, mentioned seeing a handwritten note in a file. No letterhead. No signature. It reportedly referenced long-term endocrine suppression effects. The note was not attached to any official chart and was never seen again. No copy surfaced. No name was given. The story exists only as memory, always labeled as rumor, repeated not because it proved anything but because it aligned too closely with what people were already witnessing. Whether the note ever existed cannot be verified. What can be verified is the outcome. By the early 1990s, Michael's reliance on medical control had become routine. Not reckless. Routine. Doctors rotated. Treatments continued. Oversight dissolved into convenience. Staff noticed a shift in language. He spoke less about the future and more about preservation. He worried about losing control. He feared being left alone with his body. One dancer later recalled him saying quietly, "If I stop, everything catches up." The sentence was never explained. It didn't need to be. The tragedy of this chapter is not that consequences appeared. They were inevitable. It is that they arrived disguised as professionalism, discipline, and care. A child trained to submit became an adult who could not trust his own instincts. A body managed for years became a body that could not be left unattended. By 1993, the public began to see fractures. Privately, the cost had already been paid many times over. What began as protection had become dependency. What began as delay had become damage. There is no single document confirming the worst suspicions. There rarely is. Instead, there is alignment, years of control avoidance, of maturation, medical reliance, and emotional arrest, all pointing in the same direction. The consequences did not end when the practices stopped. They followed him, embedded in habit and fear. Because when control replaces autonomy early enough, it does not disappear with age. It waits. And then it stays. Science versus Power, 1994, 2009. By the mid-1990s, the story reached a point where rumor alone was no longer enough. Speculation began colliding with something colder and less forgiving science. What could the human body do on its own, and where did intervention begin for Michael Jackson? The question no longer promised closure. It defined the boundary between biology and power. From a medical standpoint, one narrow truth is clear. Endocrinology recognizes that hormones shape the timing and texture of vocal change during puberty. Testosterone thickens the vocal folds, lowering pitch. Altering that process can delay or soften vocal transition. In controlled clinical settings, low-dose hormonal modulation has been used for specific conditions, always documented, monitored, and justified. Equally clear is what does not exist. There is no verified medical record, no peer-reviewed case file, No hospital documentation confirming that Michael Jackson underwent any such protocol. The absence matters. It places a firm limit on what can be claimed as fact. But science also confirms something else that complicates the narrative. High male voices can persist naturally. Documented cases exist of singers who retain upper registers well into adulthood due to genetics-intensive training or a typical yet natural endocrine development. Countertenors and rare pop vocalists are real. Extreme talent does not require a medical explanation. This stands as the strongest rebuttal to the theory of manipulation, and it cannot be dismissed. So why does the question refuse to settle? Because science does not operate in isolation. It operates inside systems of power. Between 1994 and 2009, what became increasingly visible was not proof of a procedure, but proof of a structure. Michael's adult life revealed a consistent pattern of intensive medical management reliance on physicians and compartmentalized care. This is documented. Court records, depositions, and staff testimonies confirm heavy dependence on doctors for sleep pain management and daily functioning. The names changed. The roles remained. Medical oversight was constant yet fragmented. No single physician held the full picture. In standard clinical practice, continuity protects the patient. In environments shaped by fame and money, continuity often yields to convenience. Doctors are hired, dismissed, rotated. Each sees a fragment. Each documents a moment. Accountability dissolves without a single rule being broken. Power imbalance is the variable science cannot measure. A child raised under absolute authority learns compliance before consent. By adulthood, that compliance often becomes reliance. Not weakness. Conditioning. Michael's public statements from the mid-1990s forward reinforce this arc. He spoke openly about fear control and the loss of autonomy in childhood. These admissions are on record. They establish motive not for a specific act, but for a lifelong pattern of surrendering bodily agency to authority figures. This is where science meets power and stalls. No lab result can confirm an undocumented intervention decades earlier. No hormone panel from the 1970s exists. No physician has produced a signed chart confirming suppression. Science demands evidence. Here, evidence ends. But power leaves a different kind of trace. Incentives, structures, repeated behaviors, silence. Economically, the motive in the early years is undeniable. A child's voice was the core asset of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Change threatened contracts, tours, and branding. Historically, the music industry has not protected minors well when profit is at stake. This context does not prove wrongdoing. It explains how a gray zone could exist. Legally, the story remains unresolved because it may be impossible to resolve. The burden of proof requires records that were never created or were never preserved. Even if an intervention occurred, it could have been framed as routine care, lost to time, or shielded by confidentiality. By 2009, the endpoint forced a reframing. The question was no longer whether a specific medical act could be proven. It was whether the system surrounding Michael made such acts possible without accountability. On that point, the evidence is stronger. Economic power, medical access, early loss of autonomy. Together they formed an environment where boundaries blurred long before anyone asked where they should be drawn. The conclusion is not a revelation. It is an admission of limits. The truth may never satisfy courts or science, but patterns remain. Motives align. Silence persists. That combination does not equal guilt. It equals unresolved risk. Michael Jackson's voice endured. It carried across decades, astonishing the world with its control and range. Yet what lingers after all timelines and denials is not a note but a cost. There is no document proving his voice was delayed by medicine. No record sealing the accusation as fact. There is also no denying the pattern of control that surrounded his body from childhood into adulthood, shaping how he ate, slept, spoke, and trusted doctors more than himself. Whether his voice was a genetic anomaly or the product of relentless management, one truth remains difficult to escape. It was never allowed to belong fully to him. And so the final question is not whether Michael's voice was altered. It is whether a child raised as an asset was ever free to grow without fear. Was the sound the world loved a miracle of nature,